The lead up to the release of Shadow of War was an interesting one. The game was marred with controversy long before it was released, with talk of microtransactions and supposedly shady DLC practices, but I'm not here to talk about that. The developers seem to have every interest in directly addressing the controversy, most notably through a massive update some 6 months ago. I want to see how that game stands up. When I first played it on its release, I completely ignored the marketplace. And on the second playthrough, there was no market to ignore. So, now that Shadow of War has released itself of those controversial shackles holding it down, how does it hold up? What works and what doesn't? Just to give some context, I've played the game twice fully. However, due to the nature of the Nemesis system, one won't be able to see everything in just those 2 playthroughs, so I've also done research on the Nemesis system and the various things that can happen. I tried all the different power struggles, but I can't comment on every single orc personality, only on the general quality of the system itself. This is also a multi-part video. Part 1, the video you're watching now, will focus on the Nemesis system specifically. Part 2 will solely be focusing on the story and story missions, and Part 3 will delve into the game mechanics. There will be spoilers for most of the game in this video series, so be warned. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get to it.
You cleaved me in 2. Any other orc would have died, but I survived. More than that, I thrived. My brothers put me back together, stronger than ever. But they didn't make me into what I am. You did. You created the machine. You should have known. Kill one Uruk, and his brother kills you. It's the law of blood. Nothing personal.
Remember when I joined your army? You were strong and I was weak. How things change.
I'm sure most people watching this will remember the release of Shadow of Mordor, the predecessor to War. All Monolith, the developers, could talk about was the Nemesis system, and all I could do was roll my eyes. There was no way a game could deliver a system where literally any orc could be your nemesis, where these orcs would remember encounters with you and have long-lasting relationships with you. It was impossible. Even 6 months after it came out, when I finally got it, I still didn't believe it, and then I played the game. The first time playing Mordor is legitimately powerful. It's so amazing how you can have your own stories with orcs that exist in the world and have their own motivation and personalities. Even a random grunt has the potential to be a massive part of your personal story. And so when Shadow of War was announced and that first gameplay video was shown, I was insanely excited. And how could I not be? They were giving friendly orcs a bigger role, making them a larger part of the organic story. There were betrayals. Betrayals! That sounded so cool. I wondered what they would possibly throw at me and how they could make the Nemesis system deeper. I can safely say that the game definitely evolved the Nemesis system. I can also safely say that I was kind of disappointed. Yeah, that's contradictory, but that's honestly how I felt both times I played it. I couldn't believe some of the things that happened in the game. I adored ambushes and blood brothers and betrayals, but I also couldn't believe that the groundwork for more interesting long-term stories wasn't there. Not just based on each individual encounter, but on a grander scale. But first, let's explain what the Nemesis system is. That's a little hard to do, but I'll try to do it in such a way as to that people who don't know what the Nemesis system is can get an idea. In short, the Nemesis system is a massive pool of procedural parts and pieces that work together to create living, unique characters that inhabit your world and come to life as orcs, that will not only interact with you, but actually remember you. If you run away, they'll remember it. If they kill you, they'll remember it. More on that later. The point is that the world is populated with high-ranking orcs that have a potential role to play in your story, and the role they play is entirely dependent on the actions of those orcs and, more importantly, you. If you kill them but they cheat death or don't actually die, they'll remember that. If you fail to kill them and retreat or die, it'll impact a potential story. Every player encounters a unique set of procedurally generated captains that continue to evolve both on the whole and as individuals throughout the game. But even if 2 players were given the same set of orcs, they would very likely still have very different stories to tell. Two-Horn the Machine may be important to me, but you might only have vaguely remembered him as that thief guy you ran into once. The orcs have a hierarchy consisting of captains at the bottom, war chiefs in the middle, and a single overlord watching and running, and I use that loosely, the region you're in. Moving up the hierarchy, along with killing you, is their major motivation in the game. They'll embark on little missions known as power struggles, where they vie for more power, or levels. This can be things like killing the massive troll-like Raug, leading a hunt, or executing a fellow captain. And sometimes this will lead captains to become war chiefs or even the overlord. Each captain has a set of weaknesses and strengths that are meant to set them apart from the other orc captains. This comes in the form of a tribe assignment, a class, immunities, weaknesses, and fears, among other things. Examples of these would be immunity to your arrows, but also being vulnerable to stealth. Even grunts, these random orcs and ologs who you usually don't think twice about, can become not just a captain if they kill you, but theoretically that random grunt that got a lucky shot could become your nemesis. Now, you are the Gravewalker, a human ranger fused with an elven wraith. This means a couple of things. Firstly, you can't die, not permanently. When Talion, your character, dies, time passes and you are revived sometime later. That orc that killed you really did it, and he'll remember that he did it next time you guys interact. Secondly, with the help of another ring of power, you're capable of part mind-controlling, part befriending the orcs so they can become part of your army. This means that they're your allies, essentially. You can command them as you see fit, assign them as your bodyguard, and use them to help you take over the fortress in each region. They still have their own motivations, but, except in rare cases, it never precedes your own motivations. Just to give you a brief idea of what the Nemesis system can do, I'll give you the brief story of 3 different orcs. The first is Two-Horn the Machine, the second is Pushcrimp Blackthorn, and the third is Douche the Rhymer. I mentioned Two-Horn above, and yes, he started off as Two-Horn the Thief. I don't remember if I was planning on dominating him or killing him, but I do remember thinking the excursion would be easy. It wasn't. So when he killed me and got stronger, I went after him. I ended up killing him, or so I thought. Later he ambushed me and revealed that despite my best efforts, he hadn't died. He had been scrounged together like a cyborg, or a machine. He then wiped the floor with me and became the war chief, cementing him not only as a powerful force in the region, but as an absolutely necessary obstacle in my path to overcome. Meaning that if I was going to claim the fortress, my main objective at the time, he was going to have to go down. An orc that had a history with me had put himself in a massively important position of power, giving my desire to claim the fortress a more personal feel. The second is Pushcrimp Blackthorn. I first met him in a different place, Minas Ithil. He ambushed me because I killed his blood brother. However, after besting me, he decided that I wasn't worth the trouble. Later I went to a different region, Cirith Ungol, and once again he ambushed me, and once again he beat me, humiliating me in the process. I ignored him after that, and under my nose, while I was doing a bunch of other things, he wormed his way into the position of Overlord. A captain that had a grudge with me, and a knack of arrogantly deciding to humiliate me, had become ruler of the region, and I had to take him down. Now, Douche was a little different. When he killed me, he was nothing but a grunt. However, I soon recruited him to my team, and he became my most powerful asset. He fought by my side and kept me alive better than any of my other allied captains. It was no question that, when I took over Nirn, he would be the Overlord. A simple grunt who learned he could rhyme became the most powerful orc in the region, and my greatest ally. These stories were all pretty organic, and that's what makes them so special. If you've ever played D&D, especially a homebrew game, then you know the DM is making it all up, and often, they have to make some of it up as they go along. Sure, there might be specific elements planned from an early stage, but the actions of the players make it so that there can't be a deliberately crafted story. So the stories you might experience in D&D don't have the same technical care that, say, a book might. Instead, what makes the stories in tabletop games so engaging is the fact that you, as a player, have a massive role to play in it. Your actions have consequences that are entirely dependent on those actions and not on some dialogue wheel. This works to cancel out the fact that the stories aren't meticulously crafted. It doesn't matter because it still engages you. This is basically what the Nemesis system tries to accomplish. No, your story with an orc captain probably won't have the second act disaster or a climax that was foreshadowed, but it does have your personal connection to it. And that's what separates the Nemesis system from other forms of storytelling in games. This is actually your story, but unfortunately it's not perfect. In fact, there are several problems with the Nemesis system that end up holding it back, and we're going to address them one by one. To kick it off, you're too powerful. Like, it actually gets really, really insane. Now, if there's one thing not lacking in depth, it's the skill tree. Because Jesus Christ, there is so much. And I honestly have to commend Monolith for being able to make every single skill unique, with most of the sub-skills also adding something legitimately unique to the table. That said, by the time you get to the end of the game, most captains won't be able to do serious damage to you, even on the hardest difficulties. You have so many tools in your arsenal that you'll have something to deal with every situation. Is that captain in a crowd of grunts and you're worried you'll get overwhelmed? Just pull him away. Fighting captains one-on-one is significantly easier anyway, but maybe he's arrow-proof so you can't pull him away. Well, if that's the case, just call on your fucking Drake, and on the off chance he's also fireproof, send 3 captains to ambush him and there's nothing you can do about it. There is almost no losing once you get this far. Rarely do captains surprise, and the only surprise is maybe an enemy captain ambush, but the problem remains. Arguably the most important part of the Nemesis system is that you can die, but your progress doesn't reset. Time passes anyway. The captain who killed you is still alive and out there. So in the beginning, you won't have many skills, and especially on harder difficulties, you'll probably die a bit. But there comes a turning point where that stops happening. And when that stops happening, then interesting stories are significantly hampered. There are 2 fixes as far as I can see. One of them is relatively easy. Make it so that captains have more tools in their arsenal to counter your moves, to truly change the way you approach fighting them. Now, it's not as simple as that because a balance still has to be maintained, but as it stands, the player is too powerful to be directly hurt very often. Secondly, make it so that captains don't solely target the player directly, like maybe they can target fellow captains or outpost control. Just something to shake it up. They already do this a little by breaking weapons if you die, but again, that requires you to die. And if defeat only happens rarely, then these stories and moments are instead replaced by a long and tedious series of mini-bosses. Of course, another part of why you become so powerful are all the items you gain from the captains you kill. Now, this isn't really a problem in and of itself, but the loot is often used as a primary justification for a few actions against captains. For example, the death threat, which narratively sounds self-explanatory, can lead to better loot by directly leveling up the orc, putting them in an instance where they're expecting your arrival. But when the primary purpose of doing it becomes gameplay focused, then it's on a mechanical level that a player will likely go about handling it. And on a mechanical level, there is no good reason to do this. It only makes the encounter harder, meaning that you'll likely lose and that the orc will grow even further, making it even harder to get that loot, that ultimately will just be surpassed by something else, probably very soon. Even if you're specifically looking for legendary loot, the chance to upgrade an epic orc to legendary isn't guaranteed. The only time that it mechanically makes sense is to do it in the endgame, but by the time you get there, you're so powerful it won't even matter. You might be thinking that increasing the likelihood of defeat is a good thing, because it adds to stories, but when it comes to creating organic narratives, you as the player should be the main force at play when you win, but when you lose, it should be the opposite. Defeat and failure should happen to you despite your actions, or else its impact is lessened, and I say that from personal experience because that's exactly what happened. I deliberately avoided death threats most of the game because the loot was never worth it, and forcing myself to fail completely missed the point of the Nemesis system to begin with, but there were times where I still did it in the hopes that maybe there'd be longer form stories, but they always rang hollow because it was forced. This is what I mean when I say the metagame gets in the way of the Nemesis system. The player motivation becomes muddled between what's mechanically advantageous and what would be best for the continuation or creation of interesting interactions between the player and the orc. The latter shouldn't even be a factor in your decision making. The game should be doing that all on its own. You shouldn't be running both sides of the script. But there's such a focus on the mechanical gains from killing orcs that it's hard not to blur the line. However, one mechanical aspect of the captains that completely failed to engage me were the tribe and class traits. You'll notice as you play the game that the orcs have various different traits, but in all likelihood, when it comes to their strengths, you'll only really care about this section. Sure, there's a few important things to note, like what enrages them or who their blood brother is, but when it comes to the big things, like their tribe and their class, it rarely felt like it had any real impact. The different tribes don't actually have their own presence in the world, save for a few presentational ones based on who's running the region. But there's no real indication beyond that the tribes even matter or even actually exist. It doesn't ever seem like the feral tribe ever works together, or even has a real problem with, say, the machine tribe, who should theoretically stand against everything they're about. This problem, again, speaks to the issue of just how overpowered you become by the end of the game. If the traits don't really impact you, then you won't notice them. Of course, things like what they're immune to will impact you, but this was already functional in the last game. That doesn't mean it's not worth praising for it still working here. It's definitely a more complicated system now, but when it comes to the bigger additions like tribes, nothing seems to really change. There are, of course, a couple of exceptions, and I wish there were more traits like this that can seriously change how you play the game. The biggest one I'm sure any player can agree with, is the no chance trait, which means that you don't get a second chance to get back into the fight. This was present in the last game, but it's not just another trait here. It's now a trait of the assassin class specifically. This made me treat these particular encounters with a lot more care, changing up my playstyle enough to at least be noticed, which is really great. But there aren't many more tribe or class traits that really impact you all that heavily. Some of the attacks, like the chain grab or the chain whip, you can easily dodge. The same goes for the tackle and even their dodge, which can be countered with almost anything in your arsenal, like isolating him and focusing on arrows, freezing him, or, again, a literal fucking Drake. Imagine if the different tribes also had their own motivations and would often work together with specific goals, like claiming the outposts that currently have very little real function. This wouldn't fix the trait problem, but it would make the tribes feel far more present than they are currently. When it comes to the tribe and class traits specifically, there needs to be more that significantly changes your playstyle. The problem is that immunities and weaknesses change it up enough as it is, or at least they're supposed to if you weren't so powerful by the end. So it might not even be worthwhile to give the different tribes or classes different traits like that. It feels like the development team ran out of ideas that really engaged the player when they got around to class and tribe traits, and honestly I don't really blame them. Focusing on giving the tribes a real presence in the world would give them the depth they so desperately need, while also working to give the trait board less unnecessary clutter. Lacking in a good transition, let's move on to power struggles. Think of this as a prelude to the massive frustration that were the story missions. Earlier I mentioned that captains will participate in events known as power struggles, which are attempts to increase a captain's overall level and gain influence in the hierarchy. The problem with these power struggles is that they are very, very mechanical. The developers promise that the captains will be going after their own goals within the world, but this is only partially true. Yes, the captains will pursue certain things, but the resolution of these events are always, and I truly mean always, based on the actions of the player. Every power struggle is on a little timer, with the maximum being 3 and the minimum and most common being 1. Every time you do something significant, like complete a power struggle or story mission, die, or deliberately pass time at one of the fast travel points, the timer ticks down. This means that if you stand in an isolated corner and do nothing, the captains in these power struggles, regardless of the timer, will remain in a limbo. If you leave the game on for 3 years, those captains will wait in a perpetual state of nothingness to do the damn thing and get on with their lives. It hampers the idea that captains are pursuing their own goals when you always happen to arrive just when something is going down. It makes the captain's actions feel conditional, not natural. This is also true even for captains who aren't in power struggles. You'll find them in one of a few quadrants. It's cool when they're doing something specific like training orcs or looking over a war table, but there's no movement to it. When it comes to the greater region, orcs will literally teleport to wherever they go next. When a captain retreats, they don't literally run away to wherever they're going next, they just teleport there. The only time this makes sense is ambushes, although even that's a bit tricky. I'm willing to excuse it because the whole point of the ambushes is to disorient and surprise you, so I don't mind the idea of an orc teleporting to your position because you shouldn't see it coming. There's probably a better way to go about it, but as it stands, this never bothered me. But I kept wondering just how different the game would be if the power struggles were actually integrated into the open world rather than delegated to various instances. For instance, when it comes to executions, we don't see the kidnapping of the captain who is to be executed. It just, I guess, happens behind the scenes. Imagine if, while you're just going about your business, 2 captains come into conflict on the other side of the map. One of them wins and takes the other as his prisoner to be executed. This is all happening naturally while you're playing the game, so when you happen upon one of these things happening, it feels far more organically integrated into the world. You're not playing missions, but instead you're an outside element in a continuously moving and evolving society. I will concede that this might be my weakest viewpoint. As it stands, I haven't heard much complaint about the power struggles, and their existence didn't really ruin the Nemesis system in any way, but I am staunchly of the opinion that the way they're handled now strays away from feeling organic. However, when it comes to war chiefs, I stand by the idea that both in the previous game and in this one, they are not handled well. Part of the problem is that the ways you can interact with a war chief are extremely limited compared to captains. If you manage to usurp them of their war chief position without killing them, this resolves that problem. It's not the war chiefs themselves, but the position. The only way you can actually interact with a war chief is by deliberately drawing them out with a very specific objective. They are not part of the world. They just aren't. They don't exist outside of the war chief missions, betrayals, pitched battles, and fortress assaults. They don't have goals. I understand the notion that war chiefs are a big deal, and so they want to stay hidden in order to not be killed or assassinated. This was the reason given last game, and I'm assuming that it sticks in this one. I understand why the Overlord is an instance. He's the big bad of each region. You want the region, you have to go through him, and just killing him in the swamp or throwing him off a random ass cliff would be pretty anticlimactic. I'm not saying that war chiefs should be given the same amount of freedom as captains. That sort of defeats the purpose of their heightened importance in the world. But as it stands, they're nothing more than glorified mini-bosses. Sometimes captains who kill you will take the place of a war chief, which helps this somewhat because they might already have personal interaction with you. But this still doesn't change the fact that war chiefs don't exist in the world, hindering their ability to interact with you in the Nemesis system. However, while power struggles and war chief missions incorporate your defeat, making them at least function within the Nemesis system, the same cannot be said for the story missions.
No matter how much time you spend with these people, you are no longer one of them.
It is folly.
You did not start this war.
One of, if not the most important aspect of the Nemesis system is the ability for the player to lose and keep going. When a captain kills you, you respawn, but sometime in the future, making your previous death a permanent event.
Menfolk! If it's one thing I can't stand, it's menfolk without the decency to stay dead!
In most games, when you lose, there aren't any real consequences other than time lost. You just retry. Even in games like Dark Souls, the consequences only extend so far as to the loss of your currency and geographical progress. But this isn't the case in the Shadow games. When a captain kills you, he remembers it, and he grows stronger as a result. It's not so much a consequence as it is a continuation of interactions between you and that captain. The reason I bring all this up is that if you take that away, then it so significantly hampers the Nemesis system that it becomes a shell of what it's meant to be. If defeat isn't a real possibility, then there's only one outcome, and that's victory, whether it be through killing or shaming a captain. If you lose, but simply go back in time and retry, it completely negates the interaction you had and any possibility of the enemy you're facing becoming your nemesis, which, you might say, is the whole point of the system. It's right there, in the name. And yet, this is exactly what the story missions do. If you lose in the story mission, even when there are orc captains in the mix, you must either restart or abandon the mission. Your defeat will have never happened, regardless of which option you choose. It's for this reason that the game feels segmented into two parts, and the attempt to fix them feels messy. As it stands, it's hard to really point out any moment in the story missions that were anything beyond okay for this reason. The only points where the Nemesis system really stand out is in the points where Bruise captures your allies and when Zog revives 6 of your greatest foes. However, as defeat is not an option, the excitement of it is immediately deflated by the fact that there's only really one outcome. As it stands, if death or defeat is not an option, then it should not be in the game. The Nemesis system only functions because time continues regardless of the outcome. I'm not saying that the story missions shouldn't be in the game per se, though I'll be making a case for that shortly. What I am saying is that this core principle needs to be implemented in the story missions. Defeat should be an outcome that can happen. I'm not even saying you can't retry the mission, but time needs to pass if you do die. However, I do wonder if the focus on a traditional story mission structure was such a good idea, if for no other reason than it took away from the focus on deepening the Nemesis system. If you've gotten this far, you might have noticed a contradiction in what I've been saying. In that little list of problems I had with the Nemesis system, I say it has a lack of depth. But I've also said multiple times that the Nemesis system is a deep one, and it is, inherently. To make so many moving parts work together so well is intensely difficult, and there's a lot more going on than what's on the surface, and quite honestly, Monolith deserves a lot of praise. So when I say there's a lack of depth, I mean relative to the progress made between the last game and this one. See, it makes perfect sense that Monolith would want to develop the Nemesis system further, and this can be seen in the allies you accrue. In the last game, when you dominated someone, they basically became an empty husk with almost no personality or real interaction with you. This was fixed quite a lot in war, and the effects of this can be seen most notably in betrayals, when a friendly captain turns on you. But it seems there was a focus on making the Nemesis system wider rather than deeper. The long-term relationship you have with orcs might seem deeper on a glance, and this is true a little bit, but in actuality, very little has really changed. Look at it this way. The Nemesis system works through events. These are where the player interacts with the captain. These events can end in one of two broad ways. You win, or they win. Your victory can come in the form of killing, shaming, or dominating the orc, or the orc running away. Their victory can come in the form of killing you, humiliating you, or you running away. That's a simple way of looking at it, but that's the crux of it. There's no real relationship between you and those orcs outside of those events. It's the interlocking of those events, the sequence of them, that creates the long-term relationship. This is how it was in the last game, but the ways in which these relationships develop pretty much end there. There are instances where greater action is hinted at, like here, where a captain ambushed me telling me the Overlord was tired of my meddling, but this doesn't have any greater impact beyond just in the moment. Let me give an example of what could be done. Imagine this. You're playing the game normally. You dominate some captains, kill others, etc. Let's say a captain you're allied with bleeds out or is killed. Could be any of them, it doesn't really matter. Sometime later, you go on a mission with another captain trying to ambush a checkpoint or something, when the captain is suddenly assassinated by a mysterious figure in the distance. You go and chase him down only for him to disappear. Not only do these assassinations continue to happen, albeit infrequently, but agents of a strange orc calling himself the Forsaken is attacking you and your captains, creating a sort of third party within the hierarchy. As time goes on, the Forsaken gets more and more bold, calling you out more and more and breaking down your forces across the regions bit by bit, until in one final confrontation, which is at least partially determined by the choices you made up to this point, it's ultimately revealed that the Forsaken is that captain you left behind, the one who died on the battlefield, getting his revenge because you didn't save him. Boom, long-term story, and it all comes from the Nemesis system. The real threat is the loss of your allied captains, which in this case is a real consequence. Now, I'm not saying that this specific example had to be in the game or something. The point is to illustrate a potential long-term story that could be done using the Nemesis system. And by the way, the Forsaken already exists in the Nemesis system, but instead of actually getting any real revenge, he just acts like every other captain in the world. He might ambush you once, but after that he'll just call you out for leaving it behind again, over and over and over. His personality says that he has more going on, but he acts like every other orc captain in the game. Here's another example. In your quest to conquer Mordor, the dead are rising. You're not sure from where, but undead orcs are popping up all over Mordor. Maybe either you look into it, or you can assign an allied orc to look into it. When that ally looks into it, he comes back, but as an undead, devoid of any reason or allegiance. As time passes, more orc captains from your past are beginning to rise from the dead, but they're slowly starting to gain reason, and over time, the undead start to hold real power in the regions. You learn that a necromancer orc has been using the dead to take over Mordor for himself. Maybe it could end with something like a fortress defense, where he summons 5 of your greatest foes to lead the assault. If you win, you defeat the necromancer and let the dead rest. If you lose, then he wins the region, and you've got your work cut out for you. Again, this concept is already in the game as one of the main story branches, but it barely uses the Nemesis system, and when it does, it has the same problem as all other unfailable story missions. The problem comes in the form of how captains act long term, and that's the exact same across the board. There is no real long term anything. Captains don't scheme and create plans or something, they don't do anything beyond power struggles and maybe ambush you. This makes any truly engaging long-term story almost impossible. It's after your first few hours in the game that all the different interactions start to blend together. I can tell you exactly what happened in Nurnen, the first region you conquer, from memory, but I've got nothing substantial when it comes to the other regions. Imagine if, instead of a main story with different branches and missions, it focused on creating a number of procedural story branches. For example, the Forsaken could take one and the Necromancer could take another. Imagine there were maybe 20 to 30 of these different premises, but each player experiences 5 or so in each playthrough. This would not only, if done right, fill up the time that the main story missions take, but would also give an immense amount of replayability. I would also like to point out that this wouldn't necessarily work in, say, Acts 1 and 3, but more so in Act 2 when the Nemesis system is really in the forefront, or at least it should be. Now, I'm not saying this would be easy, or if it was even possible, but I do wonder just how deep they could have made the Nemesis system if the main story was scrapped entirely, say for maybe Acts 1 and 3. If the focus had been on creating a Nemesis system that can sustain a full 20 to 30 hour game, what would it have been like? However, I'm of the opinion that this might actually be the direction that Monolith is heading. I've criticized the game for not doing something like this, but in reality, the game comes dangerously close to doing so. I suspect that these moments, like Bruce kidnapping your captains or Zog reanimating your greatest foes, is sort of testing the waters to long-form stories and quest chains that are built by the Nemesis system. My only hope is that as Monolith continues to develop the Nemesis system, they put much more focus on it over things that will ultimately just be overshadowed by it instead of helping it. Because as it stands, Shadow of War feels like two halves, and it's pretty clear which half is the star here. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to be notified of when part 2 and 3, and any other videos I might do, come out, you can subscribe so you're made aware when they're released. I'm not quite sure when that will happen, but it'll be in the near future. So until then, see you guys next time.